Welcome to Glenstal Abbey, everyone, wherever in the world this finds you. My name is Colman O'Clavey, and on behalf of my co-organisers of this conference, Dr. Tracy Collins and Dr. Bronit McShane, it's a very great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th Glenstal History Conference. The Glenstal History Conferences are a series of occasional conferences dedicated to exploring aspects of Ireland's religious and monastic history. There has been, as is often the case with these conferences, a slight change, which I will now share with you, to the title. The title was originally advertised as Brides of Christ, Women and Monasticism in Medieval and Early Modern Ireland. However, the subtitle, which had been carefully hidden from the honoree, was a conference in honour of Dr. Dagmar O'Rian Radel. Dr. O'Rian Radel is a distinguished German historian who has been living and working in Ireland for many decades. And much of her career has been spent exploring the links between her native country and medieval Ireland, particularly the monastic links. So we are very, very pleased to be able to, in some slight way, honour and recognise her contribution to the field over many generations. We had the pleasure just before the conference began of presenting her with the conference programme, which you see in front of you there. And we're delighted to welcome her children, Kathy, Hilda, Diarmuid and Elsa, who are joining us online as well. We're particularly grateful to our sponsors who have made this conference possible through their generous financial support. So I'd like to acknowledge the support of the National University of Ireland, the Institute of Archaeologists of Ireland, the History of Women Religious of Britain and Ireland, and Aegis Archaeology, along with Glenstal Abbey, whose support has made this conference possible in these very difficult and unusual times. We have, just as a housekeeping matter, there are, if you wish to ask a question, please do so through the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom page, and those questions will be visible to the panelists, and I will moderate them at the end of the session. But we're particularly grateful to yourselves, wherever in the world this finds you. We have been somewhat overwhelmed by the degree of interest in this conference. Over 694 people had signed up for it at midday today, from Argentina to Australia and from Venezuela to Uppsala in Sweden. So wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in, you're very, very welcome indeed to Glenstal, if only virtually. The lectures are being recorded and will be made available to those who have registered afterwards. So it's my pleasure to invite the Abbot of Glenstal, Father Brendan Coffey, to address a few remarks to the gathering and to open the conference. Abbot Brendan.
Good afternoon to all of you and welcome. As Abbot and on behalf of the monastic community of Glenstal Abbey, I want to extend to all of you a very warm welcome to the 5th Glenstal History Conference, Brides of Christ, Women and Monasticism in Medieval and Early Modern Ireland. This is the latest in a series of occasional conferences exploring aspects of Ireland's monastic and religious history. In these strange times in which we all now find ourselves, we're gratified by the large number of people joining us online for this conference. While being present online does not allow us to have the experience of visiting Glenstal in person, we hope that even virtually you will enjoy your time here among us. I am particularly pleased that this conference explores the importance of the somewhat neglected topic of women and monasticism. One hopes that both the lectures and the conference proceedings will begin to redress this imbalance. The programme contains contributions by some of the leading scholars in the field from Ireland, America, and the United Kingdom. We are most grateful for the great generosity of the speakers in sharing their time and their expertise with us during these days. In particular, I want to acknowledge the contribution of Dr. Dagmar O'Rian Riddell, to whom this conference is dedicated, as you know. Over the course of a long and productive scholarly career, Dagmar has done more than anyone to explore the monastic links between medieval Ireland and Germany, and has generously shared those findings in print and in person. As a monastic community, we have benefited from her scholarship and indeed friendship over many decades, and we are delighted to host this event in her honour, something which is richly deserved. We wish her and Padraig, along with Hilda, Kathy, Diarmuid and Elsa, every blessing in their lives and careers, and many more years of fruitful research, travel, and babysitting grandchildren. I want to say a sincere word of thanks to the conference organisers, Dr. Tracy Collins and Dr. Brona McShane, for their efforts, and the conference sponsors for their generosity. Without your help and assistance, we would not have been able to host this event. Finally, I want to thank each and every one of you in attendance here today for your interest. On this occasion, your presence among us is virtual, but I hope in the not too distant future, we will be able to welcome you in person. Please be assured that a warm welcome awaits you here in Glenstal whenever you come to visit us. I invite you to check out our website for further information about our Abbey and details of other events and courses planned in the coming months. I wish each and every one of you God's blessing, and with the greatest pleasure, I now declare this conference to be open.
Thank you very much, Abbot Brendan, for those kind words of welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Abbess Máire Hickey of Kylemore Abbey in County Galway. Abbess Máire is a Benedictine nun who has been based in Kylemore since 2008. After studying classics in Cambridge, she became a Benedictine nun at the monastery of St. Scholastica at Dinklage in Germany, where she served as abbess from 1983 to 2007. From 1997 to 2006, she was the leader of the Communio Internationalis Benedictinarum, the International Communion of Benedictine Women, the representative body of Benedictine nuns and sisters throughout the world. And few people have their finger on the pulse of what is going on in the monastic world than Mother Máire. So it's a great pleasure to ask her, or invite her, to address some introductory remarks on the topic in hand. Mother Máire.
Thank you, Brother Coleman, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon to everybody. I am Sister Máire Hickey, Abbess of the Benedictine Monastery at Kylemore Abbey, and I am greatly honoured to be opening this conference on Brides of Christ, Women and Monasticism in Medieval and Early Modern Ireland. Thank you, Brother Coleman, Dr. Tracy Collins and Dr. Brona McShane for inviting me. It is indeed more than an honour for me to be drawn into this event, because it touches me existentially. The brides of Christ, who are the subject of the conference, are a rare species, considered by many today to be critically threatened. I am a living member of that rare species, and I am glad to be able to inform you at the beginning of the conference that we are not on the verge of extinction. Right now, at the beginning of this conference, beginning of the 21st century, we are in a process of evolution. And I, for one, am passionately interested in all that can be learned about where we come from and how our predecessors have lived and survived over the past nearly 2,000 years. Like the rest of the human family, we are moving into an uncharted future, and a healthy sense of continuity with our forebears can be a helpful balance to the necessary openness about what is to come. I share Abbot Brendan's pleasure that this Glenstal conference will be a significant contribution to a field of research hitherto somewhat neglected. I don't think there have been many conferences specifically on the subject of Irish women's monasticism. Glenstal will probably be eligible to claim the honour of being the first men's monastery to open its doors to a women's history conference. But the history of women religious has not been entirely neglected during the past 50 years. Far from it. And I believe it makes sense for our present conference to be seen in the context of the scholarly work that is being done currently on the wider project. In 1988, the Cushwa Center, founded by the University of Notre Dame, Indiana in 1975 to promote research into the history of the Catholic Church in America, set up a conference dedicated specifically to research into the history of women religious, CHWR. Inspired by the initiative of the Cushwa Center, a group of British and Irish historians set up around 2000 an international research network called HWRBI, History of Women Religious of Britain and Ireland, to facilitate and support research work on the history of women religious in these islands. In 2008, the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK granted a generous sum to fund a project based at Queen Mary College, London, with the title, Who Were the Nuns? A prosopographical study of the English convents in exile in the 17th and 18th centuries. This project has given rise to an impressive amount of very lively research activity around the archives of English and Irish nuns and congregations, and is still ongoing, led by Dr. Caroline Bowden, a senior research fellow. Professor Deirdre Raftery of University College Dublin wrote fairly recently, quote, "When I first hosted that HWRBI conference at UCD back in 2014, it became very clear to me that this research field was finally taking off in Ireland. Irish scholarship was very well represented." End of quotation. It's in an article on Writing the History of Women Religious Today, which Deirdre published a couple of years ago. Until now, however, the research of HWRBI in Ireland has been exploring the stories of the many apostolic and missionary women's congregations that were founded and flourished in Ireland in the 19th century, rather than the monastic houses. These are admittedly fairly few in number, but they are a significant part of Irish women's monasticism in modern times, and could be even more so in the future. The present conference is a platform for some eminent Irish historians and emerging young academics who have been focusing, meanwhile, more on earlier centuries of monastic history. It is to be hoped that this Glenstal conference could maybe lead to a fruitful collaboration among all historians of whatever period who are engaged in the study of women's monasticism. So it is within a context of a strong movement of historical research on women religious in the Catholic Church that this conference focuses on medieval and early modern Ireland. Over the next 3 days, we will be hearing papers from 14 speakers covering a wide variety of aspects of the topic. We will be hearing about locations of monasteries, including archaeological evidence. We will be looking not just at the mainstream orders of religious women, such as Benedictines, Dominicans, but at the diversity of orders that existed and the ecclesiastical structures that controlled and supported them, and also at some of the many forms of consecrated women's religious life that were not attached to any particular order. Several contributions present facts about some social and economic aspects of the life of women religious through the centuries. Gender-related questions are raised too, and we will be hearing about the phenomenon of women's monasticism adapting itself to very different circumstances. As Irish women moved, for example, to Bavaria to be part of the Irish mission there, or whole communities moved to Spain, Portugal, France, or Belgium in the wake of persecution of the Catholic Church in Ireland. A couple of contributions deal with the early modern period, 17th to 18th century, thus connecting the research of the medievalists with that of the modern history of women religious project. The spirituality of medieval women's monasticism in Europe is to a large extent characterized by the bridal imagery of the Bible as meditated and interpreted by many of the fathers and mothers of the Church. Brides of Christ is, of course, an apposite title for a conference on the subject. But apart from being in the title, the spirituality of the nuns does not figure largely in our conference. There are very good reasons why this would not have been a good idea. The most obvious one being the lack of substantial spiritual writings by Irish women of the Middle Ages. Hildegard of Bingen, Gertrude of Helfta, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, these do not have counterparts in Irish history. I'm sure they do have counterparts in many very strong spiritual Irish women, but for various reasons, they did not write about their spiritual experience. It may be worth noting for further research that a whole picture of Irish women's monasticism in the Middle Ages would merit some consideration of its spiritual profile in relation to the rest of Europe. Our speakers include some of the leading figures in their respective fields of research, along with emerging scholars who are making exciting new discoveries. Thank you in advance, one and all of our 14 speakers, for the dedication to your subject and the hard work that have gone into preparing and promoting this conference. This 5th Glenstal conference is dedicated to a special person, namely Dr. Dagmar O'Rian Radel, a native of Germany, living and working for many years in Ireland, mainly in the history department of University College Cork. She has over 40 years enriched scholarly activity in Ireland and Germany with the profound knowledge and insights of a German academic on our country and its history. A specialist in the history of medieval Irish missionaries in Europe, she helped to launch the first Glenstal History Conference in 2005, with a comprehensive piece of work on the Schottenkloster. Within the broad sweep of medieval European history, she has written extensively about medieval manuscripts, saints, kings, pilgrimages, many things. And she has a talent for discovering and elucidating connections between Ireland and places all over the continent of Europe. Cashel, Regensburg, Cologne, Vienna, Christchurch, Dublin, Ireland and Scandinavia, Cork and France, all rub shoulders easily in her many articles. If she had a brand slogan, it would have to include the words weitreichende Verbindungen, in English, wide-reaching connections. Dagmar loves movement in history as in life and draws us into the fascinating connections that often lurk behind the litanies and pilgrimages, the buildings and manuscripts, and that can assume unexpected significance as the historian delves deeper into the chain of events. I'd like to say a word directly to Dr. Dagmar, in her own language. Liebe Frau Dr. Oriane Redel, es ist ein Glück für Irland und die irische Wissenschaft, dass irgendwann irgendwelche weitreichende Verbindungen zwischen Deutschland und Irland entstanden sind, die sie zu uns auf die grüne Insel geführt haben. Ihre Leidenschaft für unsere Geschichte und unser Erbe und ihre hervorragende wissenschaftliche Arbeit bestätigen und ermutigen uns in unserem Streben als junge Nation am Rand des Kontinents unseren Platz in der europäischen Familie einzunehmen. Wir sind dankbar für Ihre ermutigende Präsenz, die viele junge Wissenschaftler und Wissenschaftlerinnen angespornt und unterstützt haben. Möge Gott Ihr Wirken unter uns reichlich segnen und es weiterhin fruchtbar machen. And same in English. Dear Dr. Oriane Redel, it was a stroke of great good fortune for Ireland and Irish scholarship that at some point some wide-reaching connections developed between Germany and Ireland that ultimately led to your moving from Germany to us here on the green island of Ireland. Your great love for our history and our heritage and your outstanding scholarly work have done much to confirm and encourage us as we, a young nation on the margin of the continent, strive to take our due place within the European family. We greatly appreciate your encouraging presence here that has been such a source of motivation and strong support to many young historians. We ask God to bless your work among us and to continue to make it bear rich fruit. And to conclude, I am delighted to have the privilege of making these opening remarks and wish all participants an interesting and stimulating weekend with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mother Máire, for those very kind and thought-provoking words. It was very good to have the insight of a contemporary monastic woman and monastic leader, indeed, as we begin our deliberations. So it falls now to me to introduce our first formal speaker, Dr. Tracy Collins, who is an archaeologist with the National Monuments Service and a co-founder and director of Aegis Archaeology. Tracy is completing or is about to publish a book on the Archaeology of Female Monasticism in Medieval Ireland, which is eagerly awaited. And her paper this evening is entitled On the Brink of the Wave, Towards an Archaeology of Female Religious in Early Medieval Ireland. So it gives me great pleasure to call on my co-organizer, Tracy, to begin proceedings.
Thank you very much, Colman. I wonder, as we're a bit ahead of time, I wonder, should I wait until my kickoff time of 3:40, just in case we have any latecomers? You must unmute, Colman.
Okay. Yes, okay. I think that probably would be wise, in given that there will be people who will be working off the timetable, and we are somewhat ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
So
I will set up, and I will kick off then at our 15:40 or
excellent.
3:40.
Okay, so we will reconvene in what 10 minutes or so.
About that, yes.
Yeah, about 10 minutes or so. Okay,
Great.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome back to our first formal session in the Brides of Christ Conference. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tracy Collins of Aegis Archaeology and the National Monuments Service, to give her paper on the entitled "On the Brink of the Wave Towards an Archaeology of Female Religious in Early Medieval Ireland." Tracy.
Thank you. I'll just get back to the beginning. Here we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Abbess, Máire, for the great introduction and background context to all of this. And thank you to all the speakers and all of the attendees for attending this weekend virtually. So the first two sessions of Brides of Christ we have devoted to the early medieval period, which spans from about AD 450 to 1100. I am privileged to be in such distinguished company as Dr. Elva Johnston this afternoon, and tomorrow morning by Dr. Adele Vrannock and Dr. Coffey Swift. They will all detail aspects of early female religious and female saints. But in this very first paper, I'll take the plunge and attempt to summarize what we currently know and don't know of the archaeology of these women religious, where and how they might have lived, while also providing a background context for the papers that will follow. So "On the Brink of the Wave" alludes to an episode between the female Saint Cynir and Saint Senan of Scattery Island in the Shannon Estuary, possibly sometime in the 6th century, and recounted in the vernacular life of Senan. And I am sure that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the story, but I thought it an appropriate place to begin. The legend recounts that Cynir had a vision at her home near Bantry in County Cork, that all churches of Ireland were lit with a pillar of fire, and Scattery's was the largest. Cynir decided that she would be buried there, and she walked for 3 days, finally walking across the water of the River Shannon to arrive at the island's shore. But no woman was allowed to land on Senan's island monastery. And after a protracted debate with Cynir, who eloquently defended the equality of women and men in the eyes of God, she was given the Eucharist by Senan and promptly died. But to stay true to his own edicts, Senan waited until low tide to bury Cynir on the brink of the wave, in the intertidal zone of Scattery, which was not officially part of the island monastery, but fulfilled her wish while not breaking his own rules. So this interesting episode highlights numerous issues of monastic female-male relations and gender hierarchies in early Ireland, teased out excellently in Elva Johnston's 1995 Paritzia paper, and more recently by Maeve Callan in her Sacred Sisters 2020 book. It could be argued that early medieval female religious continued to inhabit this position in the liminal, peripheral, and metaphorical intertidal zone of early monasticism. This is particularly true in the current archaeologies of early medieval monasticism, which I will now attempt to introduce. So in order to set the scene for religious women, we will first briefly consider women and early society in Ireland. This is to provide a context for the second section, where the archaeological evidence is presented. And third, an overview of the themes of enclosure, segregation, and monastic rules associated with female religious in this period is made. These themes continue to have strong female associations into the later medieval period and the time of the continental orders. So from the sum of the archaeological and historical evidence, it is slowly emerging that female religious were found in a variety of situations in early Ireland. So for Ireland, the early medieval period, as we've just mentioned, is the 5th to the 12th centuries AD, is considered transformational as literacy and Christianity were first introduced as part of a Christian cultural package that reached Ireland's shores through the processes of acculturation. There are limitations in the evidence on early medieval women, not least because the sources are patchy, difficult to date, and often written to a traditional formula or topos. Moreover, sometimes terminology can appear inconsistent or contradictory, and specific groups such as women, female religious, children, or older people, for example, are sometimes not easily identified in either documentary sources or the archaeological record. But notwithstanding these limitations, light can be shed on women in this period, as we shall see. Archaeological studies are also revealing the varied character of the church in early Ireland, from large ecclesiastical sites with pastoral roles and smaller proprietary or family churches, and these all include female religious associations. So society in early Ireland was based on the principles of kingship, land tenure, and clientship. Women had their rights protected by law in property, marriage, divorce, and the family, but their status was almost always in reference to the men in their lives. So in such a society, it made sense for women to marry, as it forged alliances and brought with it a substantial bride price for the woman's family. So if marriage was the main king group strategy, what possible advantages would there be to follow a religious life? Well, 3 broad reasons have been proposed: alliances with the church, containment of surplus females, and maintenance of king group status and property. Through taking up the religious life, a woman might forge ambitious alliances with the church, bringing prestige, protection, and possible political success to her kin group. Additionally, with the practice of bride price and later dowry payments, entry to the religious life may have been an economic saving, though it does remain unclear if payment was being made upon entering a female religious community. Women, while not being legally independent, may have been donated to religious foundations, equating to a transfer of guardianship from father to church, and as Lisa Patel has noted, the legal parallel to marriage in this practice is obvious. The second advantage put forward was that entering religious communities solved the issue of surplus females in a kin group when there were too many women to be married off. And related to this, females may have also entered the religious life to limit the number of heirs in a particular kin group. These scenarios noted elsewhere have not been substantiated for Ireland, though there is no evidence to suggest that religious provision had to be made for surpluses of eligible aristocratic women. Finally, a kin group may have been established as a family church in which a religious woman might live and work, perhaps only for her lifetime or a single generation, while the kin group maintained control over its offices and property. Indeed, on occasion, women themselves may have established churches or made donations. So from an archaeological perspective, there are at least 51 sites of female religious communities dating to the early medieval period that can be identified. This must be considered an absolute minimum number, as there are many more sites that exhibit inconclusive evidence, such as female saintly dedications or some association with early female religious. And for a comprehensive list of this, you should refer to Padraig O'Riordan's 2011 A Dictionary of Irish Saints. Christina Harrington, in her Women in the Celtic Church, may have exaggerated numbers when she said there were hundreds of thousands of nuns in Ireland from the 7th to the 9th century, but they may have been common, as Patel has noted, and I quote, "Hagiographers took it for granted that nunneries littered the Irish landscape," unquote. In my research, I have divided early female religious establishments into 3 very broad and sometimes overlapping categories. First are the major sites. By far the most well-known and important was Kildare, but a handful of other regionally important sites can be identified. Second is the category comprising what I term satellite communities that were positioned adjacent to, but at a remove from, larger ecclesiastical sites. And this also includes several ecclesiastical sites traditionally considered male monasteries where female religious have been historically recorded. And finally, the third category is what has been termed lesser or other standalone communities. The distinction between this relatively large group and the first group is somewhat arbitrary, as some of these third-tier sites had important roles within their local regions. Furthermore, it is likely that their importance ebbed and flowed through time. For example, Faughart, County Louth is included in this group on the basis that it was neither a major nor satellite community, but archaeological research by Gillian Bozeman has shown that it was very important in its local and regional sphere. But many of these other ecclesiastical sites were never more than a small church that may have had a female religious function for a generation or two. So there are 7 major female religious communities which were regionally, if not nationally, important at some stages of their use, and I've listed them here on the screen. Uachtaride in County Kildare might be added to this list, as the presence of a round tower there dated to the 11th century suggests a site of some status, at least in the latter part of the period. And of this group, Clonbrony, Killarocht, Killeedy, and Kildare have little, if any, early medieval remains at all. Kildare was the premier female religious community of the period, and it is thought to have played an unusually important role in Leinster politics, as it is the only women's house to appear with frequency in the annals. It has very little early medieval fabric upstanding. The date of its firehouse structure is still uncertain. It was presumably enclosed by several concentric enclosures, with the most sacred at its centre, which contained the primary church, the position of which probably lies under the later cathedral and likely close to the round tower. The street pattern at Kildare is thought to retain the outline of its enclosures, as shown here. None of the other sites in the group retain any surface expression of their original enclosing elements. Of the remaining sites, Clonburn is important due to its assemblage of fragmentary cross slabs. Ballyvorney is the only example in this group where a research excavation has taken place, directed by M.J. O'Kelly in the 1950s. And Ballyvorney remains an important regional pilgrimage destination to the present day. Killeedy is the only major female religious house to clearly retain early fabric. 2 churches are extant at Killeedy, once about 11 metres apart, but now conjoined. The Western example being considered the older of the 2 and not later than the 9th century. The Eastern church is likely later medieval in date. There are perhaps 10 larger ecclesiastical complexes where there is some form of evidence of attached communities of female religious. I have used the term satellite communities as it most accurately describes the position of those upstanding female houses that can be considered archaeologically, such as at Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Lemenahan. From the evidence, it can be concluded that female religious communities were likely in proximity to ecclesiastical complexes, which were traditionally considered to be male-only monasteries. The women had their own discrete enclosures and, importantly, were considered legitimate constituents of the religious population of those complexes. Other such sites include, for example, Annadown, Champnaforta, and St. Bridget's in Armagh, Finglas and Tala, Lismore, and perhaps Mayo. For most of these, there is no upstanding archaeological evidence and the precise location of the female religious communities themselves, though there is some excavated evidence from Armagh. And despite the caution of St. Savnan, abbess of the female religious community of Clonbrony, to male ruin of Tala on the counselling of women, the Céile Day sites of Finglas, Tala, and Lismore do have historical evidence of female religious in proximity. Tala possessed an oratory known as Selnaningen, and a female community lived around this church. These religious women were part of the religious familia there and were sympathetically accommodated. Harrington notes they were mentioned in the Tala rules concerning monks, which stipulated that menstruating nuns were free from certain vigils and could eat a special gruel. The female community at Finglas was mentioned in the customs of Tala in an anecdote which has been interpreted as showing that female religious were not permitted into the innermost sacred enclosure, but retained their own enclosure within the larger ecclesiastical complex. The locations of the two female communities at Armagh, Champlin-na-Ferta and St. Bridget's, are known. Champlin-na-Ferta was situated outside the ecclesiastical complex to the southeast, while St. Bridget's was also to the southeast of the centre. Champlin-na-Ferta's circular enclosure is shown on Bartlett's map, shown here, dated to 1602, and is unusual in that it incorporates two lugs along its northern and southern perimeters, the function of which are unclear, but may be the remains of circular huts. A third church, possibly associated with female religious at Armagh, Máire, was located to the northwest within the Trine Moor. But the best preserved evidence of satellite female religious communities is at the Nuns' Church Clonmacnoise, St. Mary's Glendalough and St. Mella's Lemanahan. Their churches show a diversity of form, though they are all situated some distance outside the main ecclesiastical complex within their own discrete enclosures. The enclosing element in all three cases is now rectilinear rather than the more typical circular enclosures of the period. Without excavation, it cannot be verified if this represents later remodeling of their perimeters, or were they always rectangular. The archaeologist Professor Elizabeth Fitzpatrick and Cayman O'Brien noted of St. Mella's enclosure as being particularly unusual in its method of construction. So these female religious communities were outside but connected to the main ecclesiastical complexes. Clonmacnoise outside the outermost enclosure of the main complex and linked by a pavement now known as the Pilgrims Road. St. Mella's enclosure linked to the larger complex via a causeway. And a conjectured outline of the ecclesiastical enclosures at Glendalough suggests that St. Mary's was located in the second or middle of the three ecclesiastical enclosures there. So the historical evidence has numerous examples of holy women and female religious attached to churches, some of which had a laity serving function, and these I have termed lesser or smaller female religious communities. These 33 sites, and many more could be added, are represented by the various remains of smaller churches and ecclesiastical sites. The nature of these female religious communities at these places is considered very fluid. For instance, 10 are included on the basis of historical reference alone, which in many cases relates to a mention in the writings of St. Patrick, such as Carrignahorn in County Sligo and Kilreekil in County Galway, seen here. Killaboonia in County Kerry may also be a female religious community, as St. Boonia was a reputed sister of St. Patrick. And of this group, only Kilreekil and Moloch, County Tipperary, which you can see here, have possible remains of their early circular enclosures, both being preserved in roadways around the sites. Other possible early female religious sites are based solely on local memory and tradition, like Kilteal, County Kildare, for example. The majority of these lesser sites now manifest in the landscape as holy wells or later churches and graveyards, for example, and many of them are still in use today. So considering the wealth of archaeological evidence from the early medieval period and Ireland as a whole, the current dearth of material culture relating to female religious and the few archaeological investigations that have been undertaken is somewhat surprising. No intrusive excavations have been undertaken at the Nuns' Church in Clonmacnoise, but there was a geophysical magnetometer survey, though the results were somewhat disappointing. The geophysical survey at Glendalough, that you can see on the bottom of the slide there, was more successful and has revealed evidence of industrial activity to the west and southwest of St. Mary's Church. Of those that have been excavated, as at Inishleen in County Cork and Fahart in County Louth, their results were inconclusive, hampered by the later use of the sites, and nothing specifically related to female religious was uncovered. Excavations at Ballyvourney in County Cork were more fruitful, though the supposed site of the early female foundation was unsuitable for excavation due to its continued use for burial. Evidence of extensive metalworking and occupation activity was recovered from a hut site known as St. Gobnet's House, now the first station in the modern penitential route at Ballyvourney. These archaeological findings are interesting, as some people, but certainly not all people, believe Gobnet's name indicates an association with the metalworking deity Gwivna. The body of St. Lupit, sister of St. Patrick, was reputedly discovered in 1633 at Champlin-na-Ferta in Armagh, and Chris Lynn's much later excavations revealed early medieval occupation, graves, and later activity there. Important information on early medieval burial was recovered, though none was positively identified as a female religious. More recent excavations at a Have in County Fermanagh in 2000 by Rory O'Boyle, associated with the female Saint Lasar, revealed intensive occupation and use in both the early and later medieval periods, including extensive industrial activity, but nothing clearly associated with early female religious. Early medieval burial evidence is currently unclear in regard to the positive identification of women religious. Indeed, the nature of burial evidence from this period is such that it may be difficult to ever conclusively reveal female religious human remains in the archaeological record. Traditionally, the presence of female burials at monasteries has been interpreted as indicative of a lay cemetery, such as the female burial found at Church Island, County Kerry, shown here. But Harrington has critiqued this assumption by quite rightly suggesting that females buried on ecclesiastical sites may represent various types of women religious, such as vowed virgins or widows, family members of the patrons, female pilgrims, female religious in a mixed community, or clerics' wives, and some of whom we will hear about in later papers. Furthermore, segregated burial may indicate female religious, and it has long been suggested by place name evidence, as the suffix Naman and its derivatives is the Irish for women, as seen here in Champlin Naman and Relig Naman and Inishmurray in County Sligo, Relig Naman in County Tyrone, and also on Inishglora in County Mayo. Several of these sites were ecclesiastical, and so it is possible that segregated burial was practiced, though there is little contemporary historical evidence to show that it was. These segregated burial places are frequently on the edge of ecclesiastical sites, perhaps embodying these liminal qualities, and are believed to have had a variety of functions. They may have been for the wider families and kin of ecclesiastics who were not themselves part of the religious community, including lay women of status, and it may have been prestigious to be buried in such a cemetery. It has been suggested that cemeteries which have a specific female place name do in fact indicate early female religious communities. But there is not universal agreement on this interpretation, however. On the basis of the date of the place name itself, it may not be early medieval in date, and the place name may actually refer to lay women rather than a female religious community. As such, these sites may represent satellite female religious communities, though currently the evidence is far from conclusive. Over 70 excavated sites of early medieval date in Ireland have yielded female human remains, though just 4 are considered to be ecclesiastical. Therefore, on the basis of the current evidence, female burials do not occur in their own burial grounds, nor are females distinctly grouped within larger mixed cemeteries. However, 4 slab-lined kists in a non-ecclesiastical context, excavated by Dr. Elizabeth O'Brien at Ballymacaward in County Donegal, each contained a female dating to the 5th or 6th century, is a very interesting exception. There is a small number of artefacts associated with early female saints and their ecclesiastical sites. Surprisingly, there are just 2 objects associated with St. Bridget of Kildare, excluding her popular reed cross, a mantle or cloak, and a shoe, with several possible relics at Glastonbury, England, Cologne in Germany, and a skull fragment at Lisbon in Portugal. There are 4 other early female saints associated with artefacts: St. Lasar and with the book shrine the Down at Garrigate, St. Downit with the crozier, and St. Attracta with the now lost cross and cup. A rare survival is a timber statue of St. Goblet, once retained by the O'Hurleys, who were the official keepers of her church and custodians of her cult in Ballyvorney. While the book shrine and the crozier originated in the latter portion of the early medieval period, they were substantially modified in the later medieval period, while the remainder of the objects mentioned are likely later medieval in date, rather than being contemporary with their respective female saint. There are 2 early carved stones that may be interpreted as recording women, one from Clonmacnoise with the suffix Ingen or daughter that Dr. Cathy Swift has suggested may have been a monachus or ecclesiastical wife, and the other from Inishmurray, which includes the phrase Máire Bridget or servant of Bridget, and a female name, which the excavators O'Sullivan and O'Carrigan have suggested may hint at female religious burials there, despite male usually denoting a male servant. So I've now outlined the current archaeological evidence of early female religious communities. It is clearly tentative, as from a historical perspective, it is arguable if dedicated female religious communities following a rule over several generations were even commonplace in the early medieval period in Ireland. Moreover, it remains debatable to what extent archaeology can ever specifically elucidate the lives of female religious, as none of the excavations so far have indicated any gender bias in favour of females. Perhaps, however, we should not expect the archaeological record to show such binary oppositions as male and female religious in this period. It has been suggested that a specific material culture like spindle whorls may point to a female religious presence, as spinning is considered a particular activity of women in the early medieval period. It has been postulated that the early ecclesiastical site at Carlahillen in County Kerry, excavated by John Sheehan, which yielded 39 such spindle whorls, might be considered a female religious community on this basis. Though on balance, it seems more likely to have been a proprietary or family church with both male and female residents. Overall then, the current state of archaeological knowledge relating to the early medieval female religious is slight, though certainly is suggestive of a varied character. There are a number of evidential issues in the archaeological study of early female religious communities. The primary issue in this early period is the sheer number of sites. It has been estimated that there are over 5,000 ecclesiastical settlements dating from the 5th to the 12th century in Ireland, many of which have female saint dedications. Dr. Tomás O'Carrigan notes that there is a particular density of minor churches in Ireland at this time, due to the diffuse nature of power structures, which permitted a higher portion of the lay population to found their own churches. This is a vexed issue, as it cannot be definitively concluded that a female saint dedication alone can be considered to indicate a female religious community at a specific site. Furthermore, it cannot be presumed that these sites were continually occupied by female religious. The dedication may have simply indicated that a royal woman donated her bride price to the church, or that she was a female religious during her lifetime. Although the continued use of saintly dedications through time might suggest a longer female religious relationship to the site. Site names incorporating Bridget or its derivatives may also indicate a female religious use. But this is likely a simplification of a complex reality of the transmission of the cult of Bridget of Kildare, for example, and several other Bridgets over time, in a similar manner to Finbar of Cork, for example. Dr. Adele Vannock has demonstrated for parts of Leinster that ecclesiastical families align themselves with particular saintly cults, and a saint's cult could be quite extensive. Nevertheless, there may be an engendered aspect to the spread of a cult of a female saint, and secondary sites dedicated to female saints, for example, St. Bridget, might often have specifically housed female religious. Furthermore, a distinction needs to be drawn between those foundations established by a woman who lived a religious life, for example, Bridget of Kildare, Aisha of Killeedy, or Monina, and those sites that are dedicated to those female saints but were clearly not founded by them. An example of the former is Clonora, County Cork, dedicated to and believed to have been established by the female Saint Cronach sometime in the 6th century. Historical and archaeological evidence from the early medieval kingdom in which Clonora was situated, Fermanga, undertaken by Paul McCotter and Tomás O'Carrigan, suggests that it was the centre of a female religious ecclesiastical estate, which had a demonstrable different settlement pattern to two contemporary male ecclesiastical estates in the same region. Another evidential problem is that while there is a broadly consistent morphology or look of an early ecclesiastical site, usually one or more circular or subcircular enclosing elements with one or more small rectangular churches, to date, no particular features have been recognised in the archaeological record that distinguish female religious sites from the rest. The current evidence suggests that size and layout was related to status, as well as being influenced by regional variation. For example, Kildare, arguably the most important female religious house, was a large ecclesiastical complex in its own right, comparable to other contemporary major sites such as Armagh, Glendalough or Kells. It had similar archaeological features to these complexes and currently cannot be differentiated from them on the basis of the community's predominant gender. Furthermore, the reuse of many of these sites, some up to the present day as burial grounds, means that their earliest archaeological levels have been at best disturbed and at worst completely removed. So any picture of early female religious would not be complete without a consideration of the themes of enclosure, segregation, and monastic rules that were followed. Indeed, these are themes that are closely connected to female monasticism throughout the entire Middle Ages. Enclosure was a method through which monastics could secure their symbolic removal from the world they wished to renounce, in order to get closer to God and fulfill the ideal of flight from the world. From earliest times, monasticism required claustration, or the demarcation of spiritual space through detachment, which was conducive to prayer. Therefore, enclosure was always part of the monastic life as a prerequisite of all religious, regardless of their gender. Earlier historical scholarship has suggested that early female religious were strictly enclosed, particularly as Irish Christianity became more orthodox over time. This view was based on the fact that some early rules did specify enclosure, particularly those intended for female communities in more urban environments. It was also noted that through the early medieval period, enclosure of female religious was gradually more enforced and that they were restricted to areas such as education. But more recent scholarship has changed this view and concluded that for Ireland at least, there is little or no historical evidence of strict enclosure. Indeed, there is ample evidence in the saints' lives to suggest that enclosure was not even an issue. And Harrington suggests, and I quote, "to have enclosed God's brides away from the world seems not to have crossed their minds," unquote. A second point was the high regard that both the laity and church held female religious. Some, such as Maeve Callan and others who employ a more engendered historical perspective, believe that the text record not misogyny, but rather collegiality, good relations and support between female and male monasteries. Overall then, early medieval female religious seem to have had wide parameters. Where enclosures were used, these demarcated sacred space and status, rather than functioning as obstacles for access and egress. Furthermore, the locations of female religious varied, some of which could not be considered to be enclosed in very restrictive ways. In the earlier part of the period, it is highly likely that women lived with their kin group in what Follett terms household virginity, and as such were not enclosed. They may have lived at a local church or with a priest in a household arrangement, in a small or large female monastic community, a smaller female community at a male house, or a nun's residence serving the laity. And we will hear much more about these aspects in the papers that follow. This diversity is reflected in the archaeological record in the major sites, the satellite locations, and the numerous smaller sites. In regard to segregation of male and female religious, all female religious communities required at least one priest to celebrate the sacraments. Episcopal and other churches would have had male clerics already attached to perform pastoral duties, with which female religious may have assisted. Satellite female communities were likely served by clerics from the larger adjacent monasteries. Previous opinion has dictated that these female communities, such as Armagh, the Nuns' Church at Clonmacnoise, or St. Mary's, Glendalough, for example, were set at a distance from the central complex in order to segregate the sexes and in some way isolate the female religious from the most sacred space. And this may well have been the case, as female religious were not permitted to enter the inner sacred spaces at Finglas or Lismore, for example. But considered from a different perspective, perceived peripheral or liminal female satellite communities may be indicative of a specific function. For example, the association of female religious and pilgrims is a strong motif in Irish hagiography, and the early female community at Clonmacnoise at the Nuns' Church, indicated here, is situated on the Pilgrim's Road, which leads directly to the central complex. So perhaps the female religious offered the pilgrims hospitality, sustenance, and rest prior to their entry proper into the main ecclesiastical complex. Cogitosus's 7th century description and use of the Great Timber Church at Kildare has been used as evidence for the strict separation of the sexes in an early medieval monastic context, and is believed to be the earliest mention of a female religious community in Ireland. It is interesting to note how this written description can lead to several versions of interpretive ground plans by different archaeologists, which I've shown here. It cannot be known from this description if this was always the layout and form of this particular church at Kildare from St. Bridget's time to Cogitosus's own, or if this arrangement was unique to the female community at Kildare and all of the churches that were there, or if it was in operation at similar female communities elsewhere. Indeed, the interpretation of strict separation in the church at Kildare can be upended if the perspective is changed, as Harrington has done, when she suggested that Cogitosus was not threatened by female sexuality, for he stressed not the separation of the sexes, but their coming together in the church. So currently little is known of the segregation of religious females from the laity in early medieval Ireland, though judging from the wide variety of settings in which they were found in the sources, which again we will hear about later, it can be reasonably suggested that female religious and laity interacted freely, at least in some contexts and on specific occasions. So early monastic rules are known from the continent, and early Irish ideas of monasticism likely incorporated early rules of the 3rd to the 5th centuries, such as those by Benedict of Nursia, Pachomius, St. Augustine's letters, and others. The expectations of male monastic rules were never beyond the capabilities of women, either spiritually or physically, and so it is possible that early female religious lived regular lives based on a so-called male rule. But the question of men and women religious living according to a rule in Ireland remains unclear. Special instructions for both female religious and clerics have been noted in the sources, but the texts of those rules are lost for female communities, and it remains unknown specifically how and if they were administered universally. So notwithstanding the lack of tangible material evidence for early monastic rules in Ireland, what is clear from the sheer numbers of female religious in the sources is that not all lived in the major female religious communities. Rather, they lived in a wide spectrum of locations, which included satellites to large ecclesiastical complexes, regionally important churches, and at family churches. Some of these churches may have held religious women's relics, as explored by the research of Niamh Wycherley. Indeed, the definition of female religious in this period might be expanded to include additional roles, such as priest wives, hermits, and recluses. Even married couples followed a particular path of religious life by being continent on particular days. So it would appear from the current evidence that early female religious communities were rarely completely single-sexed or strictly enclosed, and that many ecclesiastical centres and smaller churches perhaps had a vowess or a community of female religious attached in some form. Therefore, female religious, as we currently understand them from the archaeology, can be described in a single word: diverse, which complements very well the corpus of archaeological evidence I've outlined here today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tracy, for that fascinating paper, quite literally earthing the conversation in a landscape and in a topography. And I think what I found very interesting as someone who works in the later period, the way in which many of the same questions that I think later historians will ask using different sources are also presented by the evidence that you work there as well. But congratulations on elucidating so much from, you know, pretty meager resources there. I propose now that we're running a little bit ahead of time, and we don't have any questions that have come in specifically for any of our earlier speakers. So I think what we might do is stick to the timetable and maybe take a 5-minute pause and then come back at 16:25 for Dr. Elva Johnston's presentation, if that's acceptable. I think that way it's fairer to people who are zoning in from different parts of the world. Okay, so we'll be back in we'll be back at 1625. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and welcome back for our second formal session this afternoon. And it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Elva Johnston of the School of History of University College Dublin, where she is an associate professor. Elva has made several important contributions to her field in recent years, and particularly with her monograph, Literacy and Identity in Early Medieval Ireland, which was published in 2013, and which was awarded the Irish Historical Research Prize by the National University of Ireland in 2015. She's a general editor of Peritia, and the Journal of the Medieval Academy of Irish, and is also a member of the Irish Manuscripts Commission. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her and to speak to us on the topic of locating female foundations in the early medieval Irish martyrologies. Elva.
Thanks, Colm, and I'd like to very much thank the organisers, and of course to thank Glenstal. When I was first approached about providing a paper to this conference, I was really intrigued because I'd become really interested in this topic. But then when I was told that the conference is going to be dedicated to Dagmar, I was absolutely delighted, and nothing could have stopped me contributing. So, you know, like I suppose all of the contributors here, I'd like very much to thank Dagmar for the wonderful contribution she has made to the field, and I really hope you enjoy this paper, which is really dedicated to you. Okay, now what I want to do is introduce you to a particular type of document, a series of texts, which I think allow us to ask some questions and maybe try out some theories in thinking about how we locate female religious communities in early medieval Ireland. And during this paper, I'm going to be very much intersecting with many of the themes and even the places that Tracy mentioned in her absolutely wonderful contribution. I mean, Tracy's paper has not only, I think, set a fantastic context for what we're doing today, but it had lots of really deep insights as well. And I had wished that I had adopted your threefold division of sites before I actually embarked on this paper, but I will try to sort of retrospectively, I think, fit it into this. So what I'm going to do for the next half hour can go very quickly. I'm going to introduce you to the source, just to give you an idea of why it's an important source, and what we can do with it, the types of material available. I'm then going to look at how we can identify women in this particular source. And finally, I want to end by putting forward questions around patterns of geographical location and maybe the scale of female foundations. Again, really taking some of those questions that Tracy so usefully introduced and looking at maybe what some of the textual evidence can say to us. Okay, this is the scary slide, and it's the one that'll be out of the way at the very beginning. So I want to say a little bit about Martyrologies and give you some context in which you can sort of fit the rest of the comments I'm going to make today. So to put it really simply, a Martyrology is a text which lists the names of saints on the days that they are commemorated. It's very important to the liturgy. If you think of the liturgical celebration of saints feast days, this is the sort of the underlying type of source behind it. Martyrologies, I suppose the origin of martyrologies lies in the early Christian period and the commemoration of martyrs, which is why they're called Martyrologies. It developed, and over time, particularly in the 3rd and 4th century, it began to take the format that became dominant in the early and the later Middle Ages. And as the Christian Church became more powerful institutionally and politically, the type of saint being commemorated, there was a much greater range of saints. So it wasn't simply martyrs, but it was people who were being commemorated for the holiness of their lives. And it was both. Now, martyrologies in their simplest form are lists of saints' names. The martyrology known as the Martyrology of Tala, that's a 12th century manuscript. The Martyrology itself dates to the 9th century. And you can actually see visually, just by looking at it, that it's a list of names, right? So it's a list of names of saints of the sort of the universal Christian Church, and then of Irish saints. So the sort of first names in the list are usually the universal saints, and then the names after that would be saints from sort of broadly the Gaelic world. But as the genre caught on, became popular and developed, these sort of simple prose lists were sometimes developed in stories and anecdotes attached to them. Sometimes they became, so there's quite a wide variety of text types. I'm going to introduce really that range. So I'm going to take sort of 2 snapshots of this tradition, one from the 9th century and one from the 12th century. And the reason I've taken this chronological range is I want to explore, can we trace continuity and changes over time? So the 9th century texts I'm looking at are the Martyrology of Tala. It survives only in one medieval copy, and that's the manuscript you see on the screen there. And if you want to look at it in more detail, I really recommend going to that website, the ISOS website, and most of the manuscript images you're going to see today come from that website. It does have several sort of lacunae or gaps in it, but we can reconstruct most of the Martyrology. Following on from this text, the Martyrology of Oengus, it's a verse martyrology. It's often called the Phailera. This martyrology takes the data essentially from the Martyrology of Tala, and it creates a more complex verse text around that, and it's much more selective. Finally, there's a series of commentary texts on the Martyrology of Oengus. It's a really popular text in the Middle Ages. These sort of coalesce together from various materials from different times by the second half of the 12th century, and they really need to be separated from that tradition. So the texts I'm going to be talking about are the first 2 there. So just to situate them a little bit more in context, these texts, they're sort of an Irish version of that martyrological tradition I mentioned. Padraig O'Riordan's, whose work is absolutely foundational to our understanding adds its own interest into the text, including around female asceticism. It's developed very much in that martyrology on the cult of relics, and women are all really central to these interests among this community known as the Céile J, so that means sort of the clients of God. So a sort of an early Irish ecclesiastical community, mainly situated in Tala and Finglas, but ultimately they spread right across the island. And as I said, the commentary texts, really need to be separated out from them because they're a good bit later, and they show, mind you, how the tradition was received and the interest that people had in them. So that's sort of my 9th century snapshot. Now, those texts, that Tala corpus of texts, I should have added, contains up to 2,000 saints' names of saints that are located in Ireland and in Northern Britain, mainly in Ireland, and about 1,500 place names. So there's a lot of material there, and I have a database based on those particular texts. Now, in the 12th century, this sort of martyrological tradition sort of resurfaces again with the Martyrology of Gorman. It's written before 1175. It doesn't survive in a medieval text. It only survives in an early modern transcription by Micheál Ó Cléirigh, sort of probably the most famous member of the so-called Four Masters. However, we do have a medieval snapshot of the text, which is preserved in one of the Franciscan manuscripts. And this is a manuscript which is known as A7. And in this manuscript, the scribe has taken the names and place names from the Martyrology of Gorman and appended it to his copy of the Martyrology of Oengus. That does probably sound quite complicated, and it is, but this is a page from that. So this is February the 1st, so it's St. Bridget. So if you look there, the large writing is the verses from Oengus. Small writing is stories about Bridget, commentary. And then if you go over and underneath that, you see names and place names. It's probably hard to see in this. Again, I recommend going to the website. You'll be able to see it really clearly there. And these names that are appended at the end of most of the days are actually those from the Martyrology of Gorman. So we do have the sort of certainty of sort of a medieval snapshot of it. Now, in terms of situating it, the reason I'm really interested in this text, and I've included it today, is it's written at a time of deep political and ecclesiastical change in Ireland. Moelmur O'Gorman, the author, he's a church reformer. He's the Abbot of Knock Abbey in County Louth. In his preface, he tells us quite a lot about why he's creating the text. He refers to the Martyrology of Tallaght and the Failure as his sources, and indeed they are his sources, mainly the Martyrology of Tallaght. And he excludes less than 5% of the saints found in the Martyrology of Tallaght. So there's almost a complete copy of the saints in the Martyrology of Tallaght. He also adds about 100, a little bit more than 100 additional saints, and these reflect his various interests. And you know, he adds in women in particular, he adds in at least 15 more female saints. And so they give us a sense of that sort of changing landscape. And just to give you an idea of why this is so important, where Moelmur is Abbot in Louth, this is a part of the island which has some of the most intensive Norman settlement following the arrival of the Normans in Ireland. And sort of that political world is very much evoked by Moelmur's preface. So it's a world in which political and religious change is happening. And what interested me was to see how does this He also creates a lot of saints through sometimes, I think, misunderstandings of the text in the Martyrology of Tallaght. I'll give you one example of that. So one of the saints who's commemorated, quite common name, is Saint Ultan, and in the Martyrology of Tallaght he's called Cua, which is a sort of a pet name form of Ultan. And when Moelmur looks at it, maybe he creatively doesn't understand it. So he creates two saints, Ultan and Tua. So he creates Tua as a separate saint. So he creates extra saints. So we don't really know much about that. And then we have additional female saints. And one really good example of this is Saint Dervla, quite an important cult out in Belmullet and in Achill, as the site on Fall Moor. She's not mentioned at all in the Tallaght documents. The first reference to her is in the Martyrology of Gorman. So he sometimes is sweeping up, I think, extra, cults that have maybe become more important over time. So, there's quite a lot of interesting material there. Okay, I think that's enough of the context, and I want to sort of move on to thinking more about identifying women in this corpus. How many of them are we talking about? So about 12% of the Tallaght corpus, and I'm using that broadly to include those three texts I'm talking about, is made up of women. So that's about 250 individuals. The reason I'm saying roughly and about and not giving you specific numbers is sometimes you'll get groups of saints such as the daughters of or the sisters, and you don't actually have an exact figure. So these are just estimates. Now, this relative ratio of female saints is actually quite high when compared to other hagiographical texts such as saints' lives. Very few women are commemorated as the main figure in a saint's life. They'll often appear, and there was that great example of Connor that Tracy alluded to. They'll often appear maybe in anecdotes in the lives of male saints, but they less frequently, very much less frequently, have lives of their own. So 12% is like really good. Now, there are difficulties in secure identification, some of this for the reasons Tracy mentioned. And then there's also, I think, quite a telling detail, which is the women are much less often identified by institutional titles compared to men. So men will be frequently described as, a priest, a deacon, a bishop, an abbot, etc. A woman is often the daughter of, sisters of, a virgin. Sometimes she might be referred to as a non-virgin, is a lot more common. And the title Banab, or Abbess, is really rare. There's only a handful, actually less than a handful of examples across that corpus, while Ab is quite common. And that's obviously, I suppose, a reflection of, in some ways, of the way the church is organized. So it's just one of those little details that comes up in the sources. Another reason that I couldn't be definitive about the number of names is that it's not always clear if the saint being commemorated is a man or a woman. In some cases, it's really clear, and in fact, the vast majority of cases, it's clear. In Irish, names are very frequently have grammatical gender. So, for example, a name ends with nod, like Gobnet, who we heard about. Downit, who we heard about, again, two of the saints mentioned by Tracy. They're definitely female saints because of the grammatical gender there. Names that end in on, so like Aenon, Phenon will be men. Names which have maybe an element, a martial element or a coup element, they'll be men. Coup Cuivnoch, Fuel Coup. Some of the names which have a flaw or ale or sovereignty, because women are sort of associated with the land and kingship in that way, will be women and so on. But many names are not necessarily men or women. So Flan, for example, is a name that can be a man or a woman. And in the martyrological context, the two that have given me by far the most trouble in identification are names that are probably, they're both associated with very famous male saints, Colum and Covgal. Obviously Colum Killa with Iona. Covgal in County Down. The name Covgal is as often as not a female name as a male name. And again, the name Colum is more often a male name, but it can be a female name. So unless you have an absolute identifier that, it's a virgin or a nun, you cannot be certain. So there's a proportion of people there you simply cannot be certain if they're men or women. It's a bit like, I suppose Tracy was saying earlier, there's evidence there, but sometimes the evidence is difficult to interpret, and you do end up with these almost sort of liminal categories. So I'm going to now describe Colum and Covgal as sort of liminal names in the Irish martyrological corpus. Now, even with these limitations, there are definite clusters of female saints that we can recognize. I'm going to get these ones out of the way really sort of at the beginning, because these are much better known than the ones I want to discuss a little bit later. So you've a cluster of female saints associated with Bridget, partly for institutional reasons. The monastery of Kildare is a really important female foundation. Bridget herself can be seen as maybe atypical in various ways in terms of how powerful her image is, her cult and so on. But that's quite a well-known cluster. It's been written about, I think, quite a bit. It doesn't really get us maybe further in terms of thinking about the span of different types of female religious foundations. Because of the interests of the KLJ, that group I mentioned earlier associated the authors of that Tallaght corpus of texts, there is a definite interest in ascetic women, and they very much admire ascetic women in the religious life. Two in particular stand out for me: Softon of Clonbrony, again, somebody we've already heard about, who appears in other KLJ related documents as a sort of almost like an ascetic superstar. Another is Ishkia, associated with a site in County Cork. Furchgeha or Ski, whose relics are, there's a commemoration of her relics coming to Tallaght. So there's definitely an interest in female asceticism and in admiration for women in their religious life, and that comes through in the documents. And there's, and because of the location of those early texts in Tallaght, we can also see a cluster of sort of associated foundations. And again, this is the pattern Tracy referred to, and you can see it absolutely in the Martyrologies. Really good example is Killininy, which is now a place name in Tallaght in Dublin. I think it's a street name, and it's the Church of the Daughters Kilnan and Nina, which there's reference to a crone of Tallaght who seems to be directly associated with the community. There's the two sisters, Ethna and Soddelov, who even get a little story. Remember, I mentioned some of the Martyrologies have little stories attached to them about how they breastfed the baby Jesus. So it's sort of thinking about the sort of spirituality of virginal saints. So we can trace that, and I just played around with Google Maps, and you can take that data material and you can actually trace sort of a cluster of churches and dedications associated with women from that corpus. So that's quite interesting. I've more to do with that, but that's something that you can certainly do with the material. What I wanted to do, though, was to think a little bit more broadly about the geography, the ecology maybe of female communities, and also about the built environment. And here, I suppose, I'm on much more speculative ground. So what I've got here, I've just taken that from the Loganum website. If you go into the Loganum website, it's really, really useful, the place names website. And they have maps generated of the most common sort of place name types. Now, obviously, one of the things to be said about this is these are place names that have been generated over several centuries. So it's not giving you a specific snapshot, but it's quite useful. So one of the things I did with my database of material is I looked at place names, what were the most common types of place names used, and could we make any types of associations of these place names with female foundations, and would that maybe give us a clue as to where we could look for them. So the types of topographical names that come up are, the most common by far is Cluan, by the way, pasture, meadow. So then you get, and you can see why this might be important. I mean, these types of place names give you a lot of insight into where churches are located. Obviously, you can see why pasture, meadowland might be important in terms of the development of your, agricultural economy. There's also references to uplands. Drim is quite common. To woodlands, Dara, Queel, Fidge. And if you look at a whole range of Irish texts, wood and woodlands are seen as very important ecological resources and are really important to the ecclesiastical economy, and particularly if you think of the buildings themselves, most of which before, certainly before the 9th century and really before the 11th century are wooden buildings. Then there's references to lakes, loch, and the Loch Erne cluster is really important there, and Inish sort of island, bog island, and so on. So that you've got one set of place names, and I need to do a good bit more work on this. So I started matching my female and my male saints, and I said, well, are men or women more likely to be on different types of, ecological or topographical locations? And actually the answer is no. It seems really similar, and I think Tracy has probably given us the answer to this. It's that really complex network and interlacing of male and female communities. So they're found in the same types of places because they're connected to each other. So that makes quite a lot of sense. I then looked at terms for the built environment of churches to see would that bring us any closer. So I looked at terms. The one that will be most familiar to you here is Kell, because it gives us the anglicized form kill. Though not every kill is from Kell. Some of those kills are actually queel or woodland. So the kill name can be a little bit misleading. But, it's Kell, so it's referring to a church building. You've terms like Dovnoch or Downnoch. Really important place name element because it refers to quite early churches, probably from before you know, the middle of the 6th century, probably even before the early 6th century. You've got D-shirt place names. D-shirt, I did debate whether I should put that into built environment, meaning given it means desert, which is sort of the opposite of built environment. But it, you know, it's a metaphorical desert associated with. And interestingly enough, every D-shirt site was associated with a man or had a male dedication. And then the other one I looked at, Ernida, which is the one is probably the least familiar to you, was the opposite. This is the one where nearly every single instance was a female, was a reference to either a female founder, a female association, or presented as a female ecclesiastical site. Now the term Ernida, it's derived from the noun to pray, and it basically means a place where you say your prayers. It's usually translated as oratory, because it sometimes will appear as a noun. So I want to give you examples of that. So these are the examples of Ernida. So I have 7 recorded examples. It's usually anglicized, by the way, as Ernie or Nerney. There's 2 that are probably the most prominent. There's an Ernie in County Cavan, and then there's one in County Tyrone. It's not clear sometimes which one is which. Interestingly, the most southerly of the Ernidas is actually the reference to Govenant at Ballyvorney. So the earliest reference to our site is as Ernida, and then it becomes Moan Moor. So that's quite interesting in and of itself, and it's something I want to do a little bit more about, because I think there's something going on there. Of those examples, 6 are identified specifically with women, and there's one example which is unclear. It could be a woman, it could be a man. It's a Machana. I would say, contextually, my feeling is it's probably a man, but it's you know, for the moment it's uncertain anyway. So what you're looking at is a very strong tendency towards that type of site, that type of built environment being associated with women. We also get narrative examples of that. So in the life of Softon, when she begins her religious life, so she begins it after she has been promised in marriage. She has she's a moment of spiritual revelation in which she realizes she wishes to be a bride of Christ. So given it's one of the few Irish saints' lives which really plays around with that idea and foregrounds it, I thought it was important to mention it in this conference. But she starts off at the dispensatrix at Ernida. Her fame then grows to such an extent that the founder of Clonbrony feels that she is going to be her successor, and so she becomes her successor, and her cult vastly overshadows that of the founder, Saint Fuinach. Now, again, just to, I suppose, again, I feel like I'm echoing Tracy quite a lot here. But then, I mean, so I'm looking at this Ernida sites and I'm going, okay, these are more than likely as not. If you see that sort of toponymic element, that's going to refer to a religious community which is associated with women, or is a female religious community. And so I was really delighted about this. I then went to the annals and discovered that the one reference to Ernida in the Annals of Ulster, now it is 1178, so it's quite a bit later, and we have to think about the various changes that would have happened in the interim, is reference to an Arcanach or an Eranach, a male sort of if you don't sort of work really directly on the early Irish church, when you see terms like Eranach, you probably run screaming. It's sort of a male lay religious custodian, I suppose, would be one way of describing it. So that's just to really sound a note of caution that it's not definite, but there's a really, I think, strong argument to be said that there's a trend to look, if we look at that type of place name, that we're probably looking at a female community. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on as well is the scale of foundations. Were female foundations smaller than those of men? And Tracy very, very usefully in her paper gave us a list of those major churches. And and in her sort of division, the sort of these major churches, satellite, associated churches, and then smaller churches. Now, I think you can actually trace some of these family churches in the martyrological material. There's many references to what seem to be small sites. They're often singular references to that site of churches that I think are within the kindred, where they refer to sisters sharing the same site. So biological sisters, or they refer to daughters of a particular man sharing the same site. You get the same, mind you, with men as well, though there's relatively far more examples of this with women in the text than there are of men. So I think that allows us maybe an insight into how that level of the female religious experience is playing out. And it's also been commemorated in these texts, which again, I think is interesting. I mean, one of the things that makes the Irish material, I think, both fascinating, but also at times extremely frustrating, is there is actually a lot of material there, but it's material that is often extremely difficult to interpret and to contextualize. But I think by looking at these examples, I think you can actually begin to map on how these are being recorded in the text. So something that we know about from other sources, I think we can record it here. Then the question is, did female foundations have institutional longevity? Many decades ago, Kathleen Hughes, one of the most, I suppose, important scholars of the early Irish Church, made the argument, and I think very convincing argument, that some female foundations did not have institutional longevity, partly because they're sort of churches within the kindred. So maybe when that immediate family dies out, the land maybe reverts. Sometimes a community may become associated with a male community. So, for example, there's a wonderful case of this in the Book of Armagh, where it describes how this nun, Cummin, she establishes a community for herself, and a very small community of herself, and I think is it 2 or 3 other nuns. And she's enabled to do that through the help of her male kindred, and then she puts that land under the protection of Armagh. So that's definitely an issue there. I do think it holds true for a lot of male communities as well. I think we could sort of reverse the question and say that really what the case is, that there's more prominent male communities than female communities, that on the level of those communities which maybe don't last as long, male and female communities actually maybe have a similar trajectory. So I wanted to sort of finish off by considering how these communities come to be commemorated over time. And the example I'm going to use is Clonburren, also mentioned by Tracy, and it's one I find really fascinating. And I'd like to thank Gary Dempsey, who provided me with these photos. So that's one of the early medieval stone fragments that Tracy mentioned. So Clonburren is associated with Clonmacnoise. It's a major church in its own right. It's strategically located on the Shannon, so it's opposite Clonmacnoise. It's on a major routeway, and we have this material evidence from it as well. Now, in the Martyrologies, what's interesting is its importance definitely increases over time. Its footprint in the written record increases over time. So this is an example of maybe greater institutional continuity. So in the Martyrology of Tallaght, Cuireadh, the founder, is mentioned, the reputed sister of Enda of Arran. And that's all we have. That's the only reference to Clonburren in the Tallaght texts, though she's a prominent enough saint. However, when we go to the Martyrology of Gorman, we get references to Gubshuck, which I just love these names, Gubshuck and Muggan, and who are also associated with the site. And then when we look at the history of that area in the 12th century, it's part of a contested political landscape. It's contested between the Irish and the Normans, and the Irishness of the site seems to have been extremely important. So I think it's an example of the site, the location of the site, its strategic location, its contested location, and also its institutional longevity being reflected in the Martyrology, so that you're getting an example of, and so these are additional saints that we're getting in Gorman. So that was an example of what I was saying about them. So we're getting more about that site. It's more prominent. If we were going by Tallaght alone, it's actually not given any prominence at all. Okay, I can see I'm beginning to run short on time, so I'm going to just finish up with a few thoughts and questions really. So locating female foundations, as we've already seen, is challenging, and particularly the fact that female communities can be associated with male communities really closely as part of their network of churches. They may start off as a female community, become a male community, and so sometimes the dedications can be a little bit misleading. Also, female communities and many male communities as well don't maybe have institutional longevity. So that's sort of the landscape you're looking at. However, what I do think is and why I think the Martyrologies are really important here, is they provide us a really valuable series of snapshots of cult dedications. And they also, you know, to a certain extent, they also capture changes over time as well. So I think that's really significant. And I suppose the final point I'd like to make is I think there's more to be done in analysing toponymic patterns and thinking about how the toponymic, the geographical, you know, the ecological context of sites maybe impact on, you know, female and male religious communities. So I think as a package, the Martyrologies offer us a lot of, you know, of really interesting, complex, but interesting insights that I think we can take further. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you all for your attention. And sorry, by the way, if the connection came and went a little bit for you while I was speaking. My Wi-Fi has broken down, and I have been doing this with my phone as a hotspot. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elva, for a fascinating paper. I was really struck by the complementarity between your presentation, drawing on the Martyrologies, and what Tracy was saying, drawing on her experience as an archaeologist, and just how both of you managed to glean so much fascinating information from such seemingly intractable sources, but which obviously in the right and in expert hands can yield all sorts of light. And some wonderful insights there. The monastery here is dedicated to St. Columba and Joseph, and I'm afraid I'm never going to look at Columba in quite the same light again after what you told us about the peculiarities of the names there. Now we do have a number of questions that have come in, and I think I'll go to those first, and then I have a couple of questions or topics that I'd like to throw up myself as a way of linking some of the points that have been made by Mother Máire and Elva and Tracy there. So the first question I think it's addressed, it's from Con Manning, and it's addressed to Tracy, but I think it's something that that Elva may wish to comment on as well. And it's Con wants to know, what do you think of Drumacoo with its female saint founder Sarnad, when the only person recorded in the annals is a male cohort in the 13th century? So can I invite?
Yeah, yes, I'll comment, and hello to Con. Con is a fellow archaeologist. Yes, Drumacoo would be in my list of those smaller, lesser sites. So, so other than the saint's name, it's very difficult to link it. It's very difficult to link it for me to female religious. But having seen what Elva can do with the documentary sources, and you would think that maybe we tic-tacked before we spoke, but we actually didn't. So if we actually put our heads together, we might come up with some great new avenues. But yes, I have Drumacoo listed. And of course, Drumacoo has that lovely Romanesque doorway as well, which is very reminiscent of the nuns' church. But again, Romanesque architecture is not just used for female houses, it's used for male houses as well. So even on decorative and architectural levels, because the same vocabulary of architecture is being used, it's very difficult to assign a female role or a male role to a particular site.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Tracy. Elva, have you any comment or
Yeah, I absolutely completely agree with Tracy. Yes, it was, as you were speaking, Tracy, I was going, my God, there are so many, we're touching base so many times. But yeah, I think that I would completely agree with what you're saying there. I think one factor as well is, and you see it actually, I think in Killeedy, is that a foundation can start off as a female foundation and it can become a male foundation. So you know, that's something that can change over time as well. So it could start off with Sorned, that, you know, it's a church which is maybe founded to a woman, you know, so it could be dedicated as well, but say it's founded by a woman and then at a certain point it becomes a male foundation. I mean, you see the opposite in Kildare, where the male foundation sort of seems to fade away. And the female foundation becomes dominant. It means usually the other way around. But yeah, that's one of those difficulties that we have in terms of the identification, is that you can maybe take a snapshot and say, you know, there's that female association then. It's like my example of that Ernida, where it's an Arcanach that's mentioned in the annals in the 12th century.
And of course, Colman, just to add as well, maybe we're looking at these things the wrong way. Maybe we're looking at them as purely male or purely female, and maybe that stark contrast was not there in the early medieval period.
Yeah, and again, that's something I would agree with. I've been working sort of in parallel to this on some of those the Talatex and their interest in sort of religious women, and it's extremely clear when you read through the Tala documents that while there's a definite boundary at certain level between male and female religious, that they're interacting all the time, they're in close proximity to each other, they're not living these separate lives at all. I mean, that's what really strikes me about those Tala documents. It's absolutely fascinating, is it just shows you how interlinked they are, and they're not necessarily thinking a lot of the time about binary oppositions at all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have a question here from Margaret Spronston, who asks, or who suggested, or who asked, do you think that the longevity relates to who the benefactors were, or how much money the local community could contribute?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I wish I thought of it myself, actually. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a factor in terms of I mean, and one thing you could do, you've made me think of something now that I should probably do. Like, one thing you could do is you could see if you could identify, as you can in some cases, say the genealogical connections of some of these women. And in cases where you can, that means they're going to be members of the elite. And then just see if you can trace their longevity. That's a really great point. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Margaret. This one is addressed to Tracy by Yvonne McDermott. And Tracy, can you tell us more about the possible female religious presence at Mayo Abbey that you mentioned?
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah, hello, Yvonne. Yeah, I actually had a whole paragraph on Mayo, which I had to delete in order to be within my time. So I can send it on to Yvonne afterwards. But yeah, there's it's with Saint Colman. It's very interesting. There's one reference that 100 nuns they die of a pestilence, I think, if I remember correctly, near Mayo Abbey, and I don't know the precise site. It doesn't specify where the site might be, and there's nothing archaeologically to tell me where it might be. But it is interesting to think about Saint Colman going to the Synod of Whitby, seeing Whitby as an early medieval mixed community with an abbess at the head, and maybe coming back to Inishbofin first with his Anglo-Saxon monks, and then moving to Mayo, and perhaps he had a small community of female religious with him as well. But that's purely speculative on my point, but we do have this reference about nuns dying of a pestilence near Mayo Abbey.
Okay. Thank you very much on this. This is addressed to Elva, and it may not be possible for you to answer. It's a technical question from Mary McCarthy. You mentioned a metaphorical desert, but the connection broke down then, and Mary was just wondering, could you briefly say something about that?
Yeah, sorry, that was probably at my end. Yeah, so when I was breaking down the different types of place name elements. So one of them is desert, which is the Irish for the Latin word for desert. And I was debating to myself, should I put it into built environment or into topographical? It doesn't really, I suppose, fit into either, because obviously, the island of Ireland isn't full of deserts. But, eventually they think of the ocean as a desert. But what it's referring to is the idea that you go into the desert, that you go into an area which is as far as possible from human habitation, and that you live a life as if you were in the desert. Now, when we look at those desert sites, the desert sites, so in English, Angus sites, that would be desert sites. Many of them are extremely important. They're very well connected, and they're as far from being, I think, either a real or a metaphorical desert as you could imagine. But it's sort of referring, I think, to an ideal, the idea of going into the desert. There's sort of a wave of foundations in the 9th century, and they use this particular element. So it's quite important for identifying some of the sites.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. If I can throw in a question, and it comes from something that Mother Máire said in her opening remarks there. You've done a remarkable job in, interrogating these intractable sources and shedding a huge amount of light on the lives and the backgrounds of these women. But how do you think, or is it possible to interrogate the same sources or other sources to get some idea of the spiritual motivation or the ascetic practices or the monastic lifestyle of these communities? And this is, as I said, comes out of Mother Máire's point about spirituality and theology, but also your remark there, Elva, about the that sort of virginal spirituality and the topos of the breastfeeding nun in some of the hagiographies.
Yeah, I actually have to say, when Mother Máire made that remark, I found it really fascinating myself, and it sort of set me thinking about whether we could, there's nothing sort of really the equivalent of a Hildegard of Bingen or a Tracy of Avila, but what I would say, if you were looking for a sense of certainly sort of the ascetic motivations, the life of Sovtan, I think is a wonderful source. It's a really interesting life. So it's commemorating a saint of the historic period rather than that legendary early period in Irish Christianity. She's an 8th century saint. She also appears in other Tala documents as well as sort of this champion of asceticism. So she comes across in a way that, say, Bridget doesn't. She comes across as a real historical person with actual motivations. And it's her life which has the whole Bride of Christ motif running through it. The life also spends a good bit of time talking about, repairing buildings. So there's a timber crisis at one point. It talks about food provision. It brings you more insights in actually sort of nitty-gritty daily issues in an ecclesiastical community than practically any other life I can think of from that period. I mean, for me, it's the outstanding example.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Elva. Anyone on the panel want to comment? Or?
Well, archaeologically speaking, it would be it's very difficult. And maybe when I started looking at these sites, I thought they would have something that would separate them out. That there would be some element that you could say, yes, this is a female site as opposed to a male site. But that didn't emerge at all. So so really for the spirituality side, we'll probably have to depend more on the documentary and the historical sources. But of course, many of these sources, as Elva knows, haven't been looked at for a long time, or haven't been looked at all, or haven't been looked at through the lens of gender and female monasticism. And maybe, a first look or a re-look at these things we might be able to tease out the spirituality in ways that Sister Máire was talking about earlier on. And that was a very insightful point, that we don't have the spirituality of these early women just yet. But the way Elva's going, she's definitely going to find some.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. We have a couple of questions that have come in that are sort of related here, and they all have to do about the evidence in either the written sources or archaeological sources on female mobility or travel for religious purpose. You know, did any Irish nuns or women go on pilgrimage to develop their spirituality? There's an element here, and would they have encountered Muslim women, which I think is probably a bit early for the period that you're talking about here, but maybe we could return to that tomorrow. So to both of you, any evidence in the archaeology for either caring for pilgrims or going on pilgrimage themselves amongst early Irish nuns?
Well, I mentioned, I can't, archaeologically speaking, I can't think of any. You know, for the later medieval period, we have material culture like pilgrim badges and things like that, where people have been to Santiago de Compostela and Rome and various places. But for the early medieval period, I can't think of any artifact that would be specifically related to female religious and pilgrimage. But, you know, I do think it's highly likely that, say, the nuns' church there at Clonmacnoise, quite likely one of its functions was to deal with the pilgrims. Rather than the nuns going out as pilgrims, they were dealing with the pilgrims coming into the site. And I leave the historical sources and the moving around to Elva. Yeah,
the documentary evidence actually suggests that they do move about quite a bit actually. At one point, and it's again something I just need to follow up more, is there's quite a number of references to religious women who have sort of gone on pilgrimage to the site where they are then located. So which I think is probably a reflection of this idea of ecclesiastical exile that you see in other texts. So that's one thing. But there's also references, not simply in the Martyrologies, but say in the saints' lives, there's a lot of references to nuns actually traveling around, going from place to place, especially when they're maybe searching for the place of their resurrection. And actually, Tracy, you gave that really good example of Connor, who goes from Bantry to Scattery Island, because that's the place of her resurrection. So, you know, and, you know, there's other things as well. So you've got them traveling around. You've also got references to literacy among religious women, you know, religious women sort of, you know, using books. Or there's a really great example of that saint I mentioned, Skia, earlier, whose relics end up in Tala. And she appears in the rather odd, in many ways, life of Saint Elva. And in this particular life, she is looking for somebody to complete a copy of the 4 Gospels, and the scribe who's doing it for her, you know, dies, and then he's resurrected to finish the Gospels. But yeah, there's a lot of references them to, definitely to sort of moving around. I mean, in terms of pilgrimage, I'd have to think about it more and separate out, you know, I suppose pilgrimage to particular sites, to the idea of traveling to the place of your resurrection as a form of pilgrimage. But it's an interesting point.
Okay, thank you very much, Elva. And as it happens, you've sort of put yourself in the firing line for another question there with your reference to the Gospels and scribes. One question that's come in from S. O'Brien: what are the likely explanations as why there are so few texts by Irish women religious? Something I think Mother Máire also touched on.
Yeah, it's some of it's related to, I suppose, the level, the amount of literacy. So, I mean, one of the things I did, you know, good few years back was I was trying to estimate, you know, what levels of literacy were there in early medieval Ireland. And you're probably looking at any one time at less than maybe 2% of the population. So many of the elite wouldn't have been literate at all unless they were in the religious life. So you're already looking at a very, very small number of people who are potential authors who will have got a literate education. Now, as far as I can see by looking at, you know, this is I suppose, the frustration of not having direct evidence. But if you look at contextual examples like, women in books, you certainly get the impression that the expectation is that women in the religious life should be able to read. I'm not certain if there's as much expectation that they can write. And we think of these two skills as being the same, but they're not actually. They're two related skills. So I think you could be looking at an expectation for having the ability to read, but not necessarily the ability to write as well. And then there's the whole issue of maybe you could write, a woman might write, but then very many of our sources are anonymous. And usually the assumption is if the source is anonymous that the author is male. Maybe that's not an assumption we should be making in such a blanket way as we do. It's a very common assumption. I've been as guilty of it as anybody, but it is an assumption. It's not necessarily the case. And trying to locate a female voice within these texts can be extremely difficult. I mean, I know there's been work done on the poem, the Cailleach Beara poem, the Old Woman of Beara, as maybe being authored by a religious woman. I think Maureen Nigonachu might have made that argument in print, that this could be a poem which reflects maybe the interior life of a woman who, in her old age, joins a religious community. But I've sort of given an answer which isn't an answer, but it's extremely difficult, and there's a lot of assumptions that we're making around the surviving texts, which may not be true.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring together two questions here. One is, do either of you have any insight into St. Crona of the Rosses area in County Donegal? Tracy showed an example of St. Dovnat's staff. What would you say is the significance of the staff, the bachel, or the symbolism of the staff in a female context?
It would be the same as for a male abbot or a crozier. You'd assume it would be the same. It would be kind of a what's the word? A signal of their office. But I think to think about with archaeological artifacts, and again with the documentary sources, that what we have been left with is a fraction of what was once extant and be in use. So it's actually, in some ways, it's a miracle that the things that have come down to us to the present day have actually survived. So we would have had a lot more material culture, a lot more books, everyday objects. We would have had a lot more of those. Probably our climate isn't great for the preserving of manuscripts and things like that. So a lot of them just would have decayed and been lost that way. But the staff would have been, an image of, or an insignia of office.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in early medieval croziers, people might like to look at Griffin Murray's work. He's done a lot of work on these, and he has radiocarbon dated some of them. And some of these, they get altered over time. So their importance, their importance is maintained for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you see them getting embellished in different ways. And it's the same with the book shrines as well. They get, they may have an origin in the early medieval period, but they get highly embellished in the later medieval period, and their functions maybe change. They become a bit talismanic in the later medieval period as well. And Ryan Loughlines' work on early Irish shrines is very important to look at in that regard as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. I was just looking at the question about St. Crona of the Rosses area in County Donegal, and I imagine the best starting point for that would probably be Pádraig O'Riordan's Dictionary of Irish Saints.
And I just put out a recommendation for that to everybody. That's an absolutely fantastic resource, and it's really accessible. And yeah, I mean, it's really based, I think, on decades of deep research and knowledge. a book I highly recommend.
Yeah, it really enables my archaeological work as well. And Elva's work on the place names. Place names are very important in archaeology as well. And they can really reveal a lot about what has happened in a particular townland or a particular parish over time. And again, Pádraic gives a lot of that information in his Dictionary of Irish Saints.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now we're coming near the end of the session, and there are two questions which I think we can use to conclude, profitably to conclude, and I'll include Mother Máire in this as well. What was the status of these women in ecclesiastical structures? How do you understand an abbess in her context?
Yeah, I suppose I'll start off with that one, because one of the things I was looking for when I went through my Martyrologies was references to abbesses, because you know it's a really important institutional role, and of course I ended up being quite disappointed that there were, relatively speaking, so few. I mean, we do know that some abbesses were really powerful and important. So the Abbess of Kildare is somebody whose importance, if anything, grows over time. So, and you can actually trace it through both looking at the hagiographical evidence and looking at the annalistic evidence. So in the lives of Bridget, for example, it starts off that Bridget, you know, there's a miracle around her becoming a nun, her veiling. That's how it appears in her 7th and 8th century lives. By the 9th century, she's been given a grade of a bishop. By the 11th century, she and her successors are given the grade of a bishop. Then if we go to the Irish annals and look at contemporary references, you have fathers killing each other over whose daughter will become Abbess of Kildare, because it's an important role. There's a reference to the Abbess of Kildare in a gloss to an Irish law tract as somebody who has a great role as a negotiator of peace. So an abbess is somebody of high status. I mean, very often when we think about the status of women, we look at the early Irish law tracts, and they present a picture in which the relative status of men and women favours men very much over women. But it is a relative system. It's not an absolute system. So an elite woman actually has better status than if you're a male slave. Okay, I know that's a very extreme example, but the system is actually relative all the way through. And it also changes over time. I mean, I don't think we should assume the situation in the 8th century is the same, for example, as the situation in the 12th century. So, I mean, you can see, and again, if you look at the annals, certain the abbesses of Kildare, you can almost do a full list of the abbesses of Kildare from references to their death notice in the annals, and only important people get referenced in the annals. So they're clearly significant. Some are more important than others, but they are certainly accorded a lot of significance. And I think you can maybe see when you look at that why it, and I'm just taking it not from, I mean, obviously there's, you know, deep religious and spiritual reasons as well, but just taking it from a practical status point of view, it's probably a way that a woman could raise their status is by entering the religious life.
Either Mother Máire or Tracy like to comment? Or
Just to reiterate what Elva said, and really it was going into the religious life now, we see it as a very kind of a vocational type of thing. And in many cases it may have been, but also it was a way to progress your career in a time when women had very few, if any, career prospects. Right across the Middle Ages. So the church was one place where you could progress in a career. And I'm sure Sister Máire would like to comment on that too.
Well, I'm not prepared to, I haven't got done the work I would need to have done the last few days to be able to answer a bit precisely about this, and especially about Ireland. I have read much more and spent much more time in Germany and on the continent. And I know there are very big differences between the development of women's monasticism, say in Germany, and we know an awful lot more about it than we would know about what was happening here. But certainly in Germany, the abbess was a very could be, not all abbesses, but could be very powerful women. There was indeed many of them would have been powerful spiritual figures, regarded spiritual leaders by women and by men, clerics and so on. But I don't think there was ever much canonical recognition of power of abbesses, although at one period there were laws that allowed an abbess to have ecclesiastical jurisdiction even over the area of her abbey. And there was one who's called the Monster of Westphalia, and I can't even remember the name of the monastery in Westphalia, who appointed priests to the parishes in the whole area rather than the bishop, but there was a lot of conflict about it. She got into trouble and it was abolished then. That was never a model, but it did happen. I don't think there would ever have been anything like that in Ireland. But I'm just very interested listening to you and Elva talking in the questions. In Germany and on the continent, I think there's much more written sources from the women themselves and about the monasteries. And in Ireland, it's very thin. But I feel, and this is, I feel it would be a mistake for me to be thinking we've got to find Irish women who are parallel or equal some way to the great women of the Benedictine women on the continent. I feel that in Ireland and in the woman and the sort of thing you were saying about the women and men monastics living together in a way. You were saying that, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Without any enclosure between them or the sort of more artificial separation. I think there's something hugely spiritually valuable in all of that, and that we would find the great spiritual strength of Irish women and nuns, maybe not necessarily through comparing them with other countries that had different history, different stories, but just kind of getting closer to what really was there. And I feel you're doing that in a wonderful way, you and Elva, this afternoon. It's very inspiring and thought-provoking for me listening to you. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't answer your question better about today, but thank you very much.
A very interesting insight. I think we're going to have to draw a line under the discussion this evening. There are three statements or three comments have come in mentioning the Abbess of Las Pelgas near Burgos in Spain, there, who seems to have been the ultimate in the Grande Dame.
That's right.
Of the monastic world there. But I think wherever you are in the world, you'll agree that we've had an absolutely splendid start to this conference with some incredibly high profile or high quality presentations. So sincere thanks to Abbot Brendan and to Mother Máire for starting proceedings, and then to Tracy and to Elva for really, really thought-provoking, in-depth, insightful presentations that have sort of cross-fertilized each other, and really you have the sense of a really rich area of exploration. And I think we're going to continue with that tomorrow in our second session with Idel Vernock and Catherine Swift, which will be going over much, some of the same ground, but from different perspectives there as well. I'd like to thank very sincerely two people who are operating behind the scene, both of them confreres of mine. Father Martin Brown is acting very kindly and very generously after a very heavy term's work in the school here as webmaster. So if I have created the illusion of competence of anything during this presentation, it is entirely due to Martin Brown. And similarly, a number of people have commented on the artwork of both the website and the page, the conference page, and that is entirely due to my confrere Emmaus O'Hurley, who's a very talented graphic designer and artist, and who's put an immense amount of thought into those. So just to thank you again, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 11. And if any of you are so inclined, I'd like to invite you to join us for Vespers at 6 o'clock in the Abbey Church. And you can do that by clicking on the live link on your programme, and you'll find that a nun is very helpfully pointing you in the right direction. But thank you so much to our speakers.